You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 14th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, we'll bring you the latest from the impeachment trial of South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. Then,
we are close to a deal, and it can get done this week. I'm not making a promise or a prediction, but it is there for the taking, and we are going to work to make it happen.
Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor there, will find out more about a possible ceasefire between Israel and Hamas currently being negotiated in Doha. Pity the author who has a book published this week. Pope Francis's memoir comes out today and it's guaranteed to hog the bestseller lists. We'll ask why he's bucking papal convention and publishing within his lifetime. The Baltic Sea NATO allies meet today in Helsinki. We'll hear about plans to protect crucial undersea infrastructure from Russia. We'll also flick through the papers with Charles Hecker and get the latest environmental news from North America. And finally,
he wasn't scared to ask us questions about what we think about being black, being white, why we demonise some people, what society was willing to take on board.
Andrew Tutt looks back at the controversial work of Oliviero Toscani, who's died aged 82. That's all coming up here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. North Korea fired multiple short-range ballistic missiles off its east coast today, South Korea's military said, marking Pyongyang's latest show of force. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has rolled out an economic plan aimed at curbing imports from China in an apparent nod to US President-elect Donald Trump and his allegations that Mexico is a backdoor for Chinese goods entering the United States. And Republican allies of Donald Trump in the US House of Representatives are trying to build support for a bill on authorising talks for the purchase of Greenland, called the Make Greenland Great Again Act. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Excuse me. Now, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol was impeached on December the 14th after declaring martial law earlier in the month, a measure that lasted just 6 hours before lawmakers overturned it. The National Assembly accused Yoon of insurrection, leading to his impeachment, and the Constitutional Court held the first oral arguments today. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by the former British ambassador to North Korea, John Everard. John, many thanks for coming in to Monocle once again. What's been happening since the warrant for Yoon's arrest was issued?
Well, there are two tracks here. The warrant for his arrest didn't get very far. The officers who went to his residence to try to take him into custody were blocked by a kind of human chain, both of a military unit that was present and also by the president's security detail. But they are likely to attempt to get him out again, perhaps using greater force. We'll see. I'll perhaps come back and say something more about that in a minute. But the impeachment is a separate process. And there, the trial actually formally started a few weeks ago, where both Yoon's lawyers and the prosecution deposited documents for the Constitutional Court to consider, which they've now done. Today was the first hearing. It was cut short because President Yoon refused to appear in person because he said he was afraid of leaving his fortified residence. He was afraid that if he went to the court, then the warrant for his arrest would be executed actually in the courtroom. But this isn't a showstopper. It just means that he doesn't get to have his say today. And the process will resume on Thursday, when the Constitutional Court will have had a chance to digest all the things that were said by his lawyers on his behalf and by the prosecution this morning. Big question is how long this process is going to take. The moment that the Constitutional Court rules that he was in fact legitimately impeached, he ceases to be the president. His security detail are no longer required to protect him, and he can be arrested. He just becomes an ordinary citizen. But last time round, when this would be in 2017, when the Constitutional Court had to consider the impeachment of then President Park Geun-hye, they did take several weeks over it. A research judge of the Constitutional Court has said that, in his opinion, they will probably take a few weeks this time and probably come to a judgment sometime next month. Let's see.
Now, meanwhile, though, the other case could have extremely serious implications. I mean, possibly the death penalty.
Yes, in theory. I mean, the death penalty tends to get bandied around in South Korea as a threat. I can't remember when the last death penalty was actually carried out in South Korea, but it might well mean at least a long period in jail. And don't forget that President Yoon's predecessor, but one, did actually go to jail. She spent quite some time there. It's not clear how serious the prosecution are about pushing this case. This is South Korea, the land of behind-the-scenes deals. And a lot of people suspect that what is happening is the prosecution have made these charges to tell President Yoon what power they have in an effort to persuade him to resign quietly and just leave the country, in which case they would presumably drop the charges and President Yoon would just vanish from the scene, which would also, of course, cut short the entire impeachment process. It's not clear either whether they're going to be able to execute their warrant even on a second attempt. They've said that they don't want any violence, and the people protecting President Yoon have made clear that they will fight to the last man, heroically, in defence of their president. So, those two positions don't really match up. One footnote on this. Now that the Constitutional Court has decided it can sit, even though it's a judge short, they've got 8 judges sitting, not 9, it also means that it can consider the position of the President's security detail, who put out quite a reasoned statement about why they felt, despite the impeachment, they had to protect the President. If the Constitutional Court says, yes, OK, we understand your position, but in fact, no, because he's been impeached, you are no longer required to protect him, and the Presidential Guard simply melt away, then that changes the situation completely, because then the officers can simply go in and take President Yoon out of his residence.
Meanwhile, though, his approval ratings seem to be going up.
Well, yes. I mean, it's one of these extraordinary aspects of a democracy, isn't it? That it's all to do with exposure. No such thing as bad news, as one politician once said. Because he's on the media all the time and he's getting a very high recognition, people are starting to like him. Isn't it bizarre?
John, while you're here, of course, North Korea is also your area of expertise. I wondered if you could speak to us a little about the North Korean prisoners in Ukraine.
Yes, 2 of them. In fact, the Ukrainians captured a third about a week ago, but he died of his wounds within a few hours of capture. But the 2 they've got now, we've established they are indeed from the North Korean Special Operations Forces, Special Forces, as you'd say in the West, the 54th Brigade, I believe. They were captured with some personal documents on them, fake IDs and so on, and they've been happily talking to interrogators thoughtfully provided by the South Korean National Intelligence Service. You wondered when they were going to spring into action, didn't you? The big point, in putting these prisoners in front of the cameras, the Ukrainians are breaching the Geneva Conventions, Article 13 of the 1949 Convention. You do not make a public spectacle of your prisoners. Point 2, up until the point when the Ukrainians did publish their photographs, the North Koreans knew only that 2 of their soldiers had been captured. I mean, they've lost a lot of men. They didn't know which of the 2 actually were in Ukrainian hands. Now that the Ukrainians have published those photographs, the North Koreans, of course, know which families have to be sent to concentration camps. So not very helpful. Not very helpful
at all. I thought it was interesting that President Vladimir Zelensky was saying that actually with prisoners, that either to try and convince North Korea to do a swap, or he said if they don't want to go home, we'll make another plan.
Yes, that's right. And one of the prisoners apparently has indicated he might want to go to South Korea. So that's another few of his relatives in concentration camp. I mean, for him to say that is okay. For the Ukrainians to publish it was, in my view, irresponsible. But there, of course, these prisoners will be under some maybe not pressure, they'll be subject to all kinds of good cajoling and inducements from their South Korean interrogators to defect. That would be a major prize for South Korea. These people, once they're in South Korea, can then be paraded and can be encouraged to say all kinds of disobliging things about the North Korean military.
And finally, John, we're reporting in our headlines about this latest barrage of missiles being fired by Pyongyang. What can you tell us on that?
Not a lot. The technical details haven't yet come through. A barrage of missiles early this morning, as you rightly say. It looks as if the North Koreans are simply testing new weapons. Remember that they are coming towards the end of a 5-year military modernization project, which appears, to judge by the frequency of testing, to be going according to schedule, so that sort of roughly halfway through this year they actually complete their modernization. There's lots of stage whispers too that they are getting technical help from the Russians in exchange for the soldiers they're providing and the munitions they're giving the Russian armed forces. If this technical help is steered towards missiles, it could well be that what the North Koreans did this morning was to try some of these new bits of technology out just to make sure they work.
John, thank you very much indeed. That was John Everard there, and this is The Globalist. It's 11 minutes past 9 in Jerusalem, 7:11 here in London. Sources from both the outgoing Biden administration and from Hamas have said that they are close to announcing an agreement and a hostage deal with Israel. Though it was stressed there were no guarantees, this appears the closest the two sides have come to an agreement since the start of the current conflict on October the 7th. Well, I'm joined now by foreign correspondent Hannah McCarthy. Hannah, have we had any confirmation of this so far?
Again, we do not have a final confirmation of this agreement. And what I would say is everyone, I think, involved talking about this is very cautious about saying that this is a foregone conclusion. We have been here before. This deal is practically identical to the one that was put forward in May, on which both Israel and walked back from, put extra conditions on. But certainly the Trump effect, people are all hopeful that the fact that Trump is coming into office is the extra pressure needed to get this deal across the line.
What are the terms of the deal as far as we know?
Sure. So, I mean, people will be kind of familiar with the broad concepts. It's broadly this idea of a release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli captives, an increase in humanitarian aid to Gaza, the return of displaced Palestinians to northern Gaza, a plan to start reconstruction in Gaza, and the reopening of border crossings. Those are the kind of broad stroke areas. And again, just for some technical detail, I mean, the idea is that 3 hostages will be released on the first day of the ceasefire and 4 more a week later. And then there's a ratio of Israeli hostages to Palestinian prisoners that will be released. We understand it's about 30 per Palestinian prisoners per Israeli hostage. And the understanding is that if there's a female soldier, it could go up to 50 Palestinian prisoners. Obviously, these details are all still being worked out, but that's kind of the rough idea so people have an understanding. And again, there's also a process that's going to be in place, we understand, for Palestinians returning to northern Gaza so that they don't bring weapons, we understand. We understand that Qataris and Egyptians will be operating some sort of X-ray machine that will monitor how Palestinians return. So that's some of the detail we're getting.
And what about Israel and the Philippine corridor?
Sure. So, I mean, last summer, people may remember, the Philadelphia corridor was the sticking point for Trump. He says, without control of this corridor, Israel would not be able to secure its future. It was a cornerstone of Israeli security. What we're seeing is that is now being walked back. So this is a phased withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza. So they are not going to immediately withdraw, which is what Hamas wanted. So some troops will remain on this kind of zone along the Gazan border with Egyptian. But we understand they will eventually withdraw. So calling into question Netanyahu's previous comments that holding this territory of land is crucial to Israeli security.
Who's been around the negotiating table? Was there anybody there that really moved the needle on this?
Well, I think the fact that Trump's team has been involved in this has been very important for putting extra pressure on Netanyahu's government. So both Biden's team and Trump's incoming team have been involved. His special envoy for the Middle East has been involved. And the fact that, both Trump has been very clear publicly that he wants this, using his language, wrapped up by the time he's in office on the 20th of January, or there will be hell to pay. So that certainly, has put pressure. And I think the fact that Trump's team is involved is important in terms of ensuring that this deal will be, enforced and supported by the American government after the transition takes place. There is no point in Biden's administration agreeing the terms of a ceasefire deal that Trump's administration are not willing to support. So that's been important. Now, there are reports that Israel seemed to be caught off guard by Hamas's apparent flexibility. Was this a surprise? Again, I think both Israel has been forced to concede some points. So again, and I think, I mean, look, no one has an inside scoop necessarily on Hamas at the moment. It's very hard to know who is actually, calling the ultimate shots. Is it Mohammed Sinwar in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar's brother? Is it the political team in outside of Gaza who are making calls on the flexibility? So it's a slightly kind of confused decision-making process at the moment. But I mean, it's a sign that people do want a deal, and there's concerns about, what would happen if Trump came to office and this was still a live issue. So if this deal happens, would it also neutralise the Houthis and other militant groups and Israel's attacks on them? I mean, it's an open question. The fact that the strikes did not start until after the war, suggests that they're likely to stop. But at the same time, there's been some quite provocative strikes between the Houthis and Israel, and whether that could continue on after the war in Gaza ends, remains an open question. Certainly there would be hopes that these fronts would calm down, but again, it's not a foregone conclusion that they would. This news hasn't been greeted with joy throughout the Middle East, and certainly there are some members of the Israeli government who think it's a very bad idea. The far-right members of Netanyahu's government have described this as a surrender agreement. For example, Bezalel Smotrich. And again, the view is that Benjamin Netanyahu has had to do some careful negotiation to get this across the line in terms of, assuaging their fears. He's really trying to emphasize to them that, Donald Trump is, a friend of Israel, that, their goals, for example, the annexation of the West Bank, could be achieved, under Donald Trump's administration. And, that's a goal that's worth appeasing Trump on getting a deal across the line. At the same time, we're also seeing some signs from Donald Trump that, he wants a deal in Gaza, but his appetite for something like annexation of the West Bank might not be as ardent as perhaps some of Netanyahu's supporters think. And finally, Hannah, I wonder about timelines. Some reports suggest that this could be agreed today. Look, until something is agreed, it is not agreed. So I think once the deal is agreed, things could move quite quickly. But again, when people use language like we are close to a deal, being close to a deal or far away from a deal, the ultimate impact is the same if they don't get across the line. So certainly, I think if it's agreed today or tomorrow, people will want to move quickly. They will want movement before Trump is in office later this month. Hannah, thank you very much indeed. That's Hannah McCarthy there. Now, still to come on the programme.
I do picture all over the world of the human race. We are all different. We are a great humanity. We have to work for that.
And that was Oliviero Toscani, who's died at 82. We'll have a look back at his life and his work. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and I'm joined in the studio by Charles Hecker, political risk analyst and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. And I just have to point you to an interview that Charles and I recently did. You can hear it on the latest edition of Meet the Writers, where Charles tells us in detail about his book, Zero Sum. So I heartily recommend you listen to that to get more of an insight into the background of this very regular contributor to Monocle Radio.
Good morning, Georgina. Thank you very much for that fantastic introduction. And we're going to jump straight into a Russia story in a very, very busy day in the papers today. And so we're going to the FT under a headline that says EU shipyards are fixing Russia's Arctic LNG tankers. And this is a bit of a head scratcher because you think, well, there are supposed to be sanctions on all of these things, aren't there? And what is the EU doing to promote the shipping of Russian energy around the world that's in support of the Russian government and helping them wage the war on Ukraine? And so as you dig into this fascinating story, we learn a number of things. And that is that the shadow fleet of tankers that is shipping Russian energy around the world, number one, is not registered to Russia. So technically speaking, the shipyards who are defending their positions here are saying we are not violating sanctions. Secondly, we also get into the nuance about how it's the cargo that is sanctioned, not the ship itself. And then the other thing is that Russian gas specifically itself is not sanctioned. The EU and Europe broadly is trying to wean itself off of Russian gas, but that's more a sort of a political and security and economic move rather than a response to sanctions. But what we have here basically is a big black eye for a Danish and a German shipyard. A Danish and a French shipyard that appear to be helping Russia when really what they should be doing is saying no.
And can we see any action being taken on this?
Well, so what these two shipyards, one of them hasn't commented in the story for the FT, but the other one has said, we're done, we're not doing this anymore. We fixed a bunch of ships. We were very, very careful and took legal advice before we did this, but we're not going to do it anymore. This is an ongoing battle for the European Union in trying to reduce its addiction, its dependency, its reliance on Russian gas. Imports are down. There's absolutely no question that the EU is using far, far less Russian gas than it has before. But, we've had a very cold winter so far, number one. Number two, prices are volatile. Number three, the market is tight. There's not a lot of excess capacity anywhere else precisely because of the shortage of gas and the cold winter. So the EU is really between a rock and a hard place in some of its energy decisions.
Let's go to the New York Times now with the wonderful headline, "The British public dislikes Elon Musk."
This is fantastic because it's great to see how the New York Times, from its London bureau, is covering the UK and how it's covering sort of the recent political turmoil that Elon Musk is causing here. And the premise of this article is really quite fascinating because it reminds us that the UK really genuinely dislikes Elon Musk, yet we listen to every single word he says, and he's completely upending British politics. And so this is what the story digs into. He has struck on a volatile moment in British politics. Because Labour is really sort of getting it in the chin on sort of some of its most recent policies and is hugely unpopular. Number two, the British press tends to sway a little bit towards the right wing, and they're more than happy to pick up on all of this. The New York Times is labeling Musk as the new Murdoch in British politics. And then, of course, the oil on the flame is Nigel Farage and Elon Musk's fluctuating relationship with this firebrand of British politics. One of the interesting conclusions at the end of the story is that British politics is incredibly online, the New York Times tells us, and that makes it extremely susceptible to these sorts of disruptions from a guy who loves throwing bombs from the sidelines.
I mean, what's been happening with this new Labour government in British politics is that they have been attacked from the get-go, haven't they? I mean, they really haven't been given a chance to establish themselves.
Yeah, it's a most unusual situation for Labour. I mean, they've come into office with an overwhelming parliamentary majority. They should be passing laws left, right, and centre like an automotive conveyor belt. But they have warned us, they tried to warn us at the very beginning of their term that they've inherited, after 14 years of a conservative government, they've inherited an extremely difficult economic situation, and they should have been prepared to be unpopular. And all of their wildest dreams are coming true because they are deeply unpopular right now in the UK. And this is something that Musk has just sort of dipped his spoon into and stirred very vigorously.
Now, one of the reasons that Musk has changed his behaviour and possibly his ideals is because of his transgender child. And that leads us to another story. Now, this is a headline in the Times, and it baffles me. Pubs could ban patrons from talking about transgender rights.
Georgina, this is the lead story on the front page of the Times today in sort of 60-point type and deep black ink. It's a remarkable story, and it says here, the subheadline says, "Overheard conversations could amount to harassment of staff. Equality and Human Rights Commission warns." This is, to outside observers who may be listening to this outside the UK, this is a part of Britain's ongoing obsession with what you can and can't do in pubs. You'll recall the conversation not too long ago about whether or not people should be able to smoke in pub gardens. Once you read through this story, though, there is a lot less than meets the eye. And this also feels like another kick at Labour, because this is a sort of the Times having a go at potential reforms to working conditions that might do this or might do that. And the story loses a lot of its punch as you read to the bottom. We aren't quite sure whether this is a bill in Parliament, whether this is a policy, whether this is a recommendation. And it's not just about transgender rights. It's about all kinds of other views. But the government has already been warned that this is a free speech issue, and you should be able to talk about whatever you like in a pub, and that being overheard is not necessarily infringement on other people's rights. So the government has external advice on the matter. This is a philosophical belief, and it's going to be very, very difficult to legislate.
I mean, it's very odd that it should apply to an overheard conversation.
Well, precisely. I mean, next time we meet in the pub, we're going to have to be very, very careful about what we talk about. The idea is that this could constitute harassment in the workplace. I mean, at the essence of this is a workplace rights issue. And that is, we are reminded actually by the Times that a lot of employees in pubs are harassed as they stand behind the bar and serve their customers. Primarily, this is sexual harassment and remarks made at women working behind the bar at the pub. And there is already law protecting them from this. It appears to be a bigger problem than we might imagine. This is an attempt to extend that protection from direct remarks to indirect remarks.
Charles, very big event coming up next week. We're talking, of course, about Trump's inauguration. Tell us about the preparations.
I couldn't pass up on this, Georgina, because I know you and I both periodically suffer from episodic bouts of Trump derangement syndrome. Georgina, The Telegraph, under the headline 25,000 police to be bussed in for Trump's inauguration, The Telegraph tells us what it takes for a peaceful transition of power. So, irony dies all over again on the pages of The Telegraph. We're going to have 25,000 police from every state in the United States. We're going to have 7,800 soldiers, 2 FBI field offices, and a partridge in a pear tree, including 30 miles of fencing and a fleet of drones and a temporary flight restriction, all to make sure that the inauguration is peaceful.
So this is an inauguration where we've seen previous enemies of Trump turning around and giving him millions of dollars to pay for this. It's also an inauguration where, if we look back at Trump's first inauguration, he had all these quibbles about numbers, how his was so much bigger than Obama's. We know that's not true. So size is going to matter this time, isn't it?
Size matters on this. The beleaguered city of Washington, D.C., the United States Capitol, is going to fund most of the costs for, this display of armaments. The millions and millions of dollars that are being given to the Trump Inaugurational Committee is to pay for the balls and the booze and the bands and the balloons. But it is quite remarkable. We should expect a much bigger turnout than for 2016 because, as you know, those turnout numbers were the beginning of the notion of alternate facts. When somebody said that, gee, it doesn't look like very many people came to the Trump inauguration, and the Trump administration fought back and said, well, that's your view of the situation. We have a different set of facts. Trump is whipping up his supporters, and I suspect we will see record crowds in Washington.
Cannot wait. Charles Hecker, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. North Korea fired multiple short-range ballistic missiles off its east coast today, South Korea's military said, marking Pyongyang's latest show of force. South Korea condemned the launch as a violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions and said Seoul would sternly respond to North Korea's provocations. And Tokyo said it's taking all possible measures to respond through close cooperation with Washington and Seoul. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has rolled out an economic plan aimed at curbing imports from China in an apparent nod to US President-elect Donald Trump and his allegations that Mexico is a backdoor for Chinese goods entering the United States. Sheinbaum also used her speech to defend the US-Mexico-Canada trade pact, which she said was the only way to compete with China. The deal is up for review in 2026. And Republican allies of Donald Trump in the US House of Representatives are trying to build support for a bill on authorising talks for the purchase of Greenland, according to a copy of the bill circulated for co-sponsors on Monday. It's called the Make Greenland Great Again Act, and if passed, will allow the president to enter into negotiations with Denmark, which owns Greenland, on January the 20th when he takes office. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, Pope Francis could be called a seasoned author. He's published books before, including Let Us Dream, his reflections written during lockdown, and Life, My Story Through History, in which he looks back on the most significant occurrences of the past 8 decades. But he's about to do something unusual and become the first pontiff to release a memoir within his lifetime. I'm joined now from our Zurich studio by Juliet Linley, who's a journalist and former Vatican correspondent. Juliet, it's lovely to speak to you again. This was not the original plan for the book. Penguin Random House had agreed to publish posthumously, as is the convention. Why is the book being brought forward?
That's correct, Georgina. The book is being released now because it's a holy year. They come around every 25 years for the Catholic world, and this year is specifically called the Jubilee of Hope. Therefore, the title of the book, Hope. And this Jubilee began on Christmas Eve. It began with the opening of the Holy Door at St. Peter's Basilica, and it'll continue throughout the year with many, many events. And that's what changed the pontiff's mind. He decided to release the book before his death so that it coincides with this holy year. And it's a year dedicated to forgiveness, spiritual renewal, celebration, as the Vatican put it. And the Pope simply said he wanted to make this precious legacy available sooner rather than later.
So the book is written with Carlo Musso, who's an Italian publisher. What do we know about him? And furthermore, what do we know about the content of the book?
So yeah, the two worked on this book for 6 years, they said. And the co-writer, Musso, is an Italian editorial executive at Mondadori, the publishing house. And, okay, the book tells this life story of this very first pope from Latin America, born in Buenos Aires in 1936. And it's sort of an intimate look into Jorge Maria Bergoglio's personal experiences, as well as his spiritual journey. So Francis in the book highlights how much of his life story is deeply connected with his family. His grandparents emigrated from Piedmont in northwestern Italy. And one excerpt that I managed to listen to, Georgina, in an audio file, tells the story of how his grandparents left their poverty-stricken existence on an epic journey by boat to seek their fortune in Argentina. And he adds in the detail that his grandmother had sewn in their life savings into a very heavy fur coat, which she kept on even once they had arrived in Argentina, where the weather was rather warmer than in freezing cold Piemonte. So that's just a little detail. But the Pope also talks, of course, of the broader journey of what he says of God's people, and at one point reflects on how an autobiography is not our private story, but rather the baggage we carry with us. And memory is not just what we recall, but what surrounds us. But Georgina, just one point, most interesting probably for us news aficionados, is that we learn about a planned assassination attempt during the Pope's March 2021 trip to Iraq. It was the first ever papal trip to that country, and the assassination attempt was thwarted by British intelligence, is what the book writes, and apparently the plot involved 2 suicide bombers, but they were reportedly intercepted by Iraqi police before the papal visit. And Georgina, the trip went on as planned. We didn't hear about it at the time when we were reporting on the trip, and it did become one of the most poignant of all the Pope's foreign trips.
I mean, so there are some surprising revelations in it. Is the Vatican taking a risk publishing while he's still alive and can be held accountable for the content?
Let's put it this way. On the one hand, I guess this allows Francis to present his story directly, openly, with personal insights that can help strengthen his legacy while he is still alive. On the other hand, of course, it does open him up to scrutiny, accountability for the content, and potentially exposes him to controversies in real time, a potential headache for his poor comms team. But this is so very much Pope Francis's style, isn't it? He prides himself on his transparency, his commitment to frankness, and he often attracts criticism for his outspokenness. So, yeah, watch this space. Once people have actually read it, it comes out today, so I can't wait to get my teeth into it. I wouldn't be surprised if certainly his conservative critics find issues to get their teeth into.
And, of course, we can probably expect this to go instantly to the top of the bestseller lists and stay there.
Well, Georgina, I've already put in a request to have him come on Meet the Writers. So let's see. But certainly, I mean, you know, he's definitely a top charter either way when his books come out. And this one in particular will probably attract even not necessarily faithful or ultra-Catholic readers, simply because it's an interesting story potentially, and it might have some controversial issues in it, since he does say that he's going to look at women's issues, as well as sexuality, technological developments, as well as migration and conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, which he has been at the center of several controversies on those topics over the last year. So let's see what surprises are in store for us.
Absolutely. Juliette Linley in Zurich, thank you very much indeed. And Hope will be published in 80 countries today. The UK edition is published by Viking and it's translated by Richard Dixon. Today, the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte is in Helsinki to attend the Baltic Sea NATO Allies Summit, hosted by the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, and the Prime Minister of Estonia. To tell us more, I'm joined by Elizabeth Braw, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for foreign policy. Elizabeth, welcome back to the show. Who else is in attendance at this conference?
It is a summit for Baltic Sea leaders, and we should remember that the Baltic Sea includes a number of countries, one of which is Russia. Russia is not part of this Baltic Sea summit, but otherwise everybody is there. And the reason everybody else is there, is Russia. There have been, as I think your listeners know, there has been an increase in attacks on undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. And these countries have to do something about it. But what you can do is not clear. So this is an effort by these two leaders and their fellow leaders to at least show unity and show that they're taking it seriously.
So I wonder if you could give us some detail about the damage to this critical undersea infrastructure recently.
Yes. So first of all, I should say I started looking at it a while ago, and then it turned out that I'm now writing a book about it, but I never expected it to take off the way it has taken off in just the past 6 weeks or so. So we had the 2022 attack on the two Nord Stream pipelines, then we had an October 2023 incident involving several cables and a Chinese vessel, then another event or incident, I should say, in November last year, also involving a Chinese vessel. And then on Christmas Day, this was sort of the most brazen incident so far, which really got politicians involved and aware that they need to do something. That attack was on Christmas Day in Finnish waters in the Gulf of Finland, and a ship just sailed across a bunch of cables, and the Finns caught it. But you won't be that lucky every time. You won't be able to catch every perpetrator in the act of damaging the undersea cables. And this is the challenge, and that's why these leaders have to find a way of communicating that there will be a price to pay. But and I have to bring up the boring aspect of international maritime rules. It is very hard under international maritime rules to detain the vessels unless it is in your territorial waters and you catch the vessel in the act of damaging your undersea infrastructure.
And of course, this damage is done in a way that can be, I mean, there's plausible deniability, isn't there, in terms of just, an anchor's carelessly dropped.
Totally. And so each time, apart from Nord Stream, each time the damage has been caused by a dragged anchor. And unfortunately, these captains can always claim that they didn't know they were dragging the anchor. And you can say, well, hang on, you feel the difference if you as the crew are dragging your ship's anchor, or if you're sailing normally. It's like driving your car with a big container tied behind the car. You feel that you notice the difference, but they can say, "Oh, I didn't notice anything," and you can't go into their heads and prove that they are lying. And this is the problem.
I mean, Elizabeth, there have been many warnings about a looming war between Russia and Europe. But could these incidents be interpreted as Russia already being at war with the West?
So what Russia is doing is very clever. It is using tools and forms of aggression that are not military in nature, but can cause considerable harm. And we are seeing that strategy growing, accelerating very quickly. And if you're Russia, you would be a fool to use military means against NATO. It doesn't mean that Russia will never do it, but the Kremlin would be a fool to do it. What is much more productive is to use non-military means, because then NATO is not in a position to respond. NATO responds to military attacks. It doesn't respond to. It's not in charge of retaliating against some ships dragging their anchors across some cables on the seabed of the Baltic Sea. And this is the challenge, and nobody knows what to do about it, because, yes, NATO member states want to defend themselves, but this is not NATO's responsibility. But at the same time, doing nothing is also not an option.
What more can you tell us about Russia's shadow fleet?
Yeah, so this is something I started looking at when it began growing very rapidly, which was in late 2022, when the West imposed a bunch of sanctions on Russian oil, specifically the price cap. So Western entities can no longer trade in Russian oil above $60 per barrel. And that meant that Western P&I insurers, so essentially maritime accident insurers, could no longer insure Russian oil being sold above the price cap. And that matters because those insurers are essentially the only insurers of that kind. So if you don't get that sort of insurance, you don't have insurance. And to sail anywhere, you need insurance. So Russia turned to the shadow fleet. And the shadow fleet until then had been around maybe 150, 180, 90 ships. When Russia started using the shadow fleet, it exploded. So it's now over 1,000 vessels. And that means that, especially among oil tankers, the shadow fleet is now a significant share of the global fleet. The oil tanker fleet, it's about 17%. So it's like a growing cancer. And when it was 1 or 2%, you could sort of ignore it because it didn't cause that much harm. With now that it's at a much higher percentage, you can no longer ignore it. And what we have seen is Russia also apparently turning to the shadow fleet or shadow vessels to perpetrate acts of harm. So not just causing accidental harm by leaking and having various engine failures and fires on board, but also causing deliberate harm.
And how much can we expect to see NATO's presence, therefore, expand in the region? And will that just inflame Russia?
NATO is expanding its presence in the Baltic Sea in response to Russian non-military aggression against undersea infrastructure. And it's just so happened that Russia had a strong shadow fleet presence in the Baltic Sea to begin with, because most of the oil that Russia exports above the price cap sails from or is transported from Russia's Baltic Sea port. So it has to travel, these shadow vessels travel through the Baltic Sea, 2 or 3 of them every day of the year. So NATO has decided it needs to show a presence in the Baltic Sea, a stronger presence in the Baltic Sea. So it will have vessels that sail around, show their presence, and essentially tell the Russians that it would be a good idea to get up to mischief. But what we don't know is how NATO will respond if Russia does get up to mischief, because those vessels would, I think, be extremely unlikely to take action in case they saw ships behaving suspiciously. You really have to catch a ship in the act of committing harm, and you have to catch it in the territorial waters. And most importantly, it's a law enforcement matter. So naval ships can't just detain ships that they think have violated laws, and this is the challenge. So then I think one other aspect is if NATO does respond, Russia is likely to respond back. It's likely to say, hang on, what are your vessels doing? Detaining, legally sailing, or detaining civilian vessels. We will now escort those vessels. And then you have NATO vessels on one hand, Russian Navy vessels on one hand, all in the small ocean.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, very, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. That was Elizabeth Braw, and this is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time now to talk climate with Sheena Rossiter, Monocle's contributing editor, who joins us now from Edmonton. Sheena, of course, the headlines are still full of the LA fires. Can you tell us, can you give us the latest updates from Los Angeles?
Yeah, there's still 3 wildfires that are raging in Los Angeles County. So, of course, there's the Palisades fire, which is the largest one. It's still burning about 23,000 acres, and it's only 14% contained. There's the Eaton fire. That's the second largest at 14,000 acres, which only 33% of that fire is contained. And then the Hearst fire, which is the smallest of the 3, about 800 acres, and that's almost out at 97% contained. But things are getting more bleak by the day. So far, at least 24 people have died, and fires have destroyed more than 12,000 structures, and it's expected to be the costliest disaster in U.S. history. Just to give you an idea, some initial estimates of the damage and the economic loss is now exceeding $250 billion US dollars. And it's only expected to continue with more fire weather going on the way. They've already pre-deployed firefighters to Los Angeles County area on going through to Wednesday. And on social media, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, shared that the state has already deployed an additional 300 firefighters to join the more than 15,000 that are already on the ground.
And Sheena, politically, what's been talked about regarding the fires?
Yes, it's definitely split between the Republicans and the Democrats. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who is a Republican, he said that he believes that there should be conditions on the disaster to aid California, citing that, quote, state and local leaders were derelict in their duties. Hours after this comment was made, President Joe Biden said to the media in a briefing that Congress needs to, quote unquote, step up and to provide more funding.
So, Sheena, how does climate change trigger wildfires specifically?
Well, the exact cause of these wildfires specifically in California, it's still under investigation, and the start of it is unknown. Some have suspected that it is man-made. Experts have said, though, that it's a combination of environmental factors which have created optimal conditions this calendar year for fires to basically rapidly spread. Southern California has not had significant rainfall for months. So just to give you an indication that the latest map showed that only 39.1% of California was completely drought-free, and that's less than last year, which was at that time, this time last year was 96.7% drought free. So extremely dry conditions have caused the vegetation to become extremely parched, therefore highly flammable. And Los Angeles has an abundance of other things that are just flammable. So the infrastructure, low-hanging power cables, and wooden telephone poles. So all of these things have just kind of led to the fire spreading.
Let's change our focus now and look to where you are, north of the border in Canada. How big of a concern is climate change for the agriculture industry there?
So this is really interesting because in a recent survey that was released by Farmers for Climate Solution, they commissioned a national poll where they basically sent out a survey to almost 900 farmers and ranchers, about 850 completed in full. And they said, when posed with an open-ended question, what's the biggest challenge you're going to face in the next decade? Most of the farmers and ranchers did say that it was climate change. 76% reported being impacted by severe weather in the past 5 years. And farmers and ranchers, they're basically looking to kind of future-proof themselves against climate change impacts. And they're worried about the restrictive policies and regulation that are reducing income yields and having negative effects ultimately on their mental health.
But isn't agriculture a big cause of climate change?
Yes, this is the catch-22. So although farmers and ranchers are heavily impacted by climate change, the agriculture sector emits huge greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from crop production. In fact, in 2021, the last time Canada had its national census, agriculture was the 5th largest emitter in the sector in Canada. So farmers and ranchers, though, they don't really see themselves as contributing to the problem. In fact, 86% of farmers and ranchers consider themselves to be good land stewards, and 46% feel that they can do more to improve their outcomes, of course. But they're basically looking at ways to lower emissions and to drive up profits, because that's really what it's all about for them, is to bring down their impacts on climate change, but so they can yield more crops and ultimately line their pockets more.
Sheena, thank you very much indeed. That's Sheena Rossiter there, and you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally on today's show, Oliviero Toscani, the Italian fashion photographer known for his work on Benetton's provocative advertising campaigns, died yesterday, aged 82. Well, joining me to discuss his life and legacy is Andrew Tuck, our editor-in-chief. Andrew, thanks for coming in. Why are Toscana's Benetton campaigns considered so controversial?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think this was the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. And the work was commissioned by Benetton, which at the time was most famous for kind of making nice pastel-coloured jumpers that were worn by the likes of Lady Di. She made the brand famous here in the UK. They were just a fashion brand. So the controversy was, is this company really interested in activism, in challenging people's perceptions and prejudices? Or is it just using these issues to sell jumpers. And that was always the bit that nobody could ever quite work out. And some people, both on the right, on the left, were enraged by what he did. But he also did provoke, I think, questions in our minds that it did attack your prejudices. So he had a famous example of a black mother breastfeeding a white baby. Now, it raised his questions for society. Are you uncomfortable with a black woman adopting a white baby? Do you know what happened in the past when black women were often used to be nursemaids to white babies? But somehow it became very uncomfortable for people. He had a picture of they were actors, but of a priest kissing a nun. The church was enraged. This was a time when unfolding already in the newspapers were stories of what priests were up to with young boys, with kids. It was a provocation to ask about sex in the church and to have a debate around those issues. But without doubt, the most controversial work was around AIDS and about what happened then. And I think there, again, people were unsure what was going on. In the early 90s, I was working at another media organisation then, and I went along to a demonstration organised by a thing called ACT UP and Outrage, and they were fearless campaigners for questioning what was happening around HIV and AIDS. And they went to the Benetton store on Oxford Street here in London, and I was there when they did a sit-in, and people were arrested, and they were just angered because these adverts had come out with HIV stamped on people's arms, almost like the Holocaust numbers. Toscani would say, look, I'm challenging you. What do you think about someone who's got HIV? Why is it such a label that upsets you? But these people were clear that this was not being used to aid, to support the cause of people who had contracted HIV, but to sell jumpers, and they hated it. So they were controversial.
Toscani also co-founded the art school Fabrica, which is funded by Benetton. What can you tell us about that institution?
Again, it came up at an interesting time when he was working with Tibor Kalman, a man who I met several times and who I think he was only in his late 40s when he tragically died of cancer, or died of cancer rather. But here they tried to take some of the things that they'd learned from doing Colours magazine and from the work that he'd done in photography, and to using the Benetton wealth to create a school. And they were doing amazing things. They had great photographers go through there. They had this really creative space. And I must say that, Kalman plus Toscani, when you saw the work they did in Colours magazine as well, it was pretty interesting work. They took a single issue every time. They looked at everything from topical issues like HIV and race, but they looked at food, and they looked at why we got fat. They had a cover of a magazine with just someone holding up rolls of fat, or rolls of diminished fat because the person had been on some epic diet. Now, again, these are questions that are worrying us now about obesity, about Ozempic. They were there. They were questioning these big issues. So, yeah, it wasn't just a series of billboard campaigns. And, Georgina, that's the other funny thing when you think back, because in advertising then it wasn't all digital, kind of like popping up on your phone. These were epic pieces of outdoor advertising, and you saw them. You were confronted with these issues. So I think history will be kind to Toscani and generous. Indeed, today, the likes of Giorgio Armani have praised the work that he did in being such an extraordinary creative force, and an Italian one at that. But, we have to remember this was a very different media landscape. And actually, I think some of these things would provoke people now. People would feel challenged about it. But he wasn't scared to ask us questions about being black, being white, why we demonise some people, what society was willing to take on board.
Oliviero Toscani, who's died at the age of 82. Many thanks there to Andrew, and that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Hassan Anderson, Tom Webb and Carlotta Rebello, our researcher Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalists will return at the same time tomorrow, and in between, of course, there's plenty of sharp programming that you can download from our website, including the latest episode of Meet the Writers, which features frequent Monocle contributor Charles Hecker talking about his book about Russian business Zero Sum. That's all from me. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.